The morning had started like every other morning at Buckingham Palace, quiet, precise, and wrapped in that particular kind of silence that only exists in places where silence is enforced by tradition rather than choice. The long corridors carried the faint smell of polished wood and fresh flowers, the kind of flowers that get replaced before they even begin to think about wilting. Everything about the palace operated on a schedule so tight it could make a Swiss watchmaker feel sloppy. Senior Royal Protection Officer David Hartley had been on the King's security detail for going on 11 years. He had stood outside more doors than he could count. He had watched the changing of the guard more times than the tourists who showed up with cameras every morning. He knew which floorboards creaked on the east corridor, which door on the second floor sometimes stuck in humid weather, and exactly how many steps it took to walk from the main entrance to the private study used by King Charles. 27 steps. He had counted them so many times they had become automatic, like breathing. This particular Tuesday in late autumn had a grey sky pressing down over London, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or just threatened to. The gardens outside were bare-limbed and still. Inside the palace, the heating had been turned up just enough to take the edge off, and the staff moved through their routines with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that in this building, the routine was the point. David had taken his post outside the King's private study at 8:30 that morning. The King was inside. That much was confirmed. His aide had briefed David at 8:15. King Charles had a clear schedule until 11, no visitors expected, no calls scheduled until 10. He wanted the morning to work through private correspondence and some personal reading. Standard. Unremarkable. The kind of morning David had facilitated dozens of times. He stood with his back straight and his eyes moving left, right, down the corridor, back again. His earpiece sat snug and quiet. The radio traffic from other officers posted around the building came through in short bursts. Everything was calm. Everything was ordinary. Then, it wasn't. The first sound came at 9:42. David heard it through the heavy oak door of the study, a voice, raised well above conversation level, carrying the sharp edge of agitation. Not a shout exactly. More like the moment just before a shout, when someone's control over their volume is slipping. David's hand didn't move toward his radio yet. Voices got raised. Even kings had moments of frustration. Maybe a phone call had gone sideways. Maybe he'd read something in the morning correspondence that had set him off. David had heard worse through thicker walls. He waited. 40 seconds passed. Then, the voice came again, louder this time, and unmistakably not King Charles. David knew the king's voice the way a musician knows the key of a song before the first note finishes. 11 years had given him that. And, whatever was coming through that door was not it. The pitch was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. It had an urgency to it that didn't match anything that should have been in that room. His hand went to his radio. Control, this is Hartley. I'm outside the private study. I'm hearing a raised voice inside that doesn't match the principal. Confirmed no scheduled visitors. Requesting status check. The response came back in under 10 seconds. Confirmed, Hartley. No visitors logged. No appointments. Aide confirms no one has been cleared to enter since 8:40. David's hand was already on the door handle. The protocol for these situations had been drilled into him until it lived somewhere below conscious thought. You don't wait when you can't account for a voice in a secured room. You don't stand outside and speculate. You go in. You assess. You protect. Everything else comes after. He pushed the door open. The study was a warm room, high-ceilinged, lined with shelves of books on 3 sides. A wide desk sat near the window. A reading chair occupied the corner to the left, angled toward a standing lamp. Maps and framed photographs covered the remaining wall space. It smelled faintly of paper and something herbal, a tea probably, still steaming on the desk. King Charles was standing near the window, turned at the sound of the door opening, his expression caught somewhere between startled and amused. He was alone. Or almost. Perched on the arm of the reading chair, in a posture that communicated absolutely no awareness of having done anything unusual, was a gray African parrot. Stocky, sharp-eyed, with a beak that looked like it had been designed by someone who took the concept of biting very seriously. The bird cocked its head at David with an expression of pure assessment. Then, it spoke. "Absolutely not," it said, in a voice that was not quite human and not quite anything else, loud, clear, dripping with offended conviction. David stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched longer than it had any business doing. King Charles, to his considerable credit, did not laugh immediately. He managed to hold it together for perhaps 3 full seconds before his shoulders started going. The parrot, whose name, David would learn shortly, was Winston, had been a gift to the king some years prior, and had lived in a comfortable suite of rooms near the private quarters, cared for by a specialist handler. He was, according to everyone who had ever dealt with him, extraordinarily intelligent, deeply opinionated, and possessed of a vocabulary that had been described variously as impressive, troubling, and, on one occasion by a visiting dignitary, frankly unsettling. He had, at some point between 8:40 and 9:42, gotten out. This was not, it turned out, entirely unprecedented. Winston had escaped his enclosure twice before, both times finding his way with what seemed like deliberate purpose into rooms he was not supposed to be in. The first time he had turned up in a sitting room used by household staff, where he had spent 20 minutes repeating phrases he had apparently picked up from a television program and had reduced 2 housekeeping staff to genuine tears of laughter. The second time he had gotten into a storage room and had spent an unknown amount of time alone among the contents, emerging with what appeared to be a new range of vocabulary that his handler had described as coming from nowhere and refused to elaborate on. This was the third escape. And he had, with what felt in retrospect like a kind of artistic choice, gone directly to the king's private study. David stepped fully into the room and pulled the door closed behind him. King Charles, now making no real attempt to suppress his amusement, gestured at the bird with one hand in a way that managed to convey both apology and delight simultaneously. "I'm afraid," the king said, "that I may have been having a rather one-sided argument." Winston, as if in response, puffed up slightly and said, with crisp and unambiguous authority, "No. No. Absolutely not." David looked at the bird. The bird looked at David. The bird's expression, if a parrot could be said to have an expression, was one of complete composure. He was not remotely concerned about being caught. He was not remotely concerned about anything. "He got out again, sir," David said, which was perhaps the least necessary observation he had made in 11 years. "So it would seem," the king said. What followed over the next several minutes, as David radioed for Winston's handler and the king settled back into his chair with his tea, was a kind of quiet chaos specific to situations that are technically a security breach but are also genuinely funny. Winston moved from the arm of the reading chair to the edge of the desk, where he examined the king's correspondence with what appeared to be professional interest. He nudged a pen with his beak. He tilted his head at a photograph. He made a sound that was either a comment or a complaint. It was difficult to tell the difference with Winston, from what David was gathering. The handler arrived within 6 minutes, a compact, unhurried woman named Margaret Osei who had been working with African gray parrots for 23 years and who had, from the look of her, not spent a single one of those years being surprised by anything a parrot did. She came into the study with a carry perch and the calm of someone arriving to collect a misplaced umbrella. "There he is," she said, in a tone that was affectionate and completely without drama. Winston looked at her. He looked at the perch. He looked back at the desk. He said, "No," with the certainty of a judge delivering a verdict. Margaret set the perch down and waited. She had the patience of geography. Winston held his position on the desk for another 30 seconds, conducted a final review of the king's correspondence, and then stepped onto the perch as if he had decided to leave entirely of his own volition, on his own schedule, as a matter of personal choice. Which, Margaret would explain afterward to David in the corridor, was essentially how it always went. You did not retrieve Winston. You created conditions under which Winston chose to cooperate. The distinction, she made clear, mattered to him. By the time Winston had been carried out and the door to the study was closed again, the story had already started spreading through the household staff in the way that genuinely good stories do, not gossiped, exactly, but shared, passed between people with the specific delight of something that is both absurd and entirely true. David stood back at his post and replayed the moment of walking through that door. The raised voice. The certainty that something was wrong. The door opening onto a gray parrot arguing with a king. He had been on the job 11 years. He had never written an incident report that began with the words, "The intruder was approximately 12 inches tall and gray." The afternoon passed without incident. The evening was quiet. David finished his shift at 6, signed out, walked to his car through the cold London air, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Winston on the desk. The pen being nudged. The absolute refusal to be hurried. He started the car. He was still smiling when he got home. The story, of course, didn't stay inside the palace walls for long. These things never do, not entirely. The palace is a working building with hundreds of staff, and working buildings run on human beings, and human beings tell stories. Not to journalists, not in any official capacity. The people who work at the palace understand discretion the way they understand the daily schedule, which is to say they understand it completely. But, within the community of people who move through those corridors every day, the story of Winston and the King's Study became one of those internal legends, the kind that gets told at the end of a long shift or over a cup of tea in the staff room. The version that circulated in the days that followed had the essential facts intact: the raised voice, the security response, the parrot. Some tellings added color. In one version, Winston had been found sitting in the king's chair. In another, he had greeted David's entry with a phrase too specific to have been coincidental. In a third, which had no basis in anything but was too good to fully die, he had somehow gotten hold of a biscuit that had gone missing from the king's tea tray and had been eating it with the focused satisfaction of someone who had planned the whole thing. Margaret, for her part, said very little when asked. She had the professional composure of someone who has learned that the stories attached to her work are usually better than anything she could add to them. When a junior staff member asked her how Winston kept getting out, she looked at them for a moment and said, "He's very clever," in the tone of someone who considers that a sufficient and complete explanation. The enclosure, in the days following the study incident, received 2 additional modifications. Margaret oversaw both. She did not seem particularly confident they would hold, and she said as much when asked, in the matter-of-fact way she had of saying things. Winston, for his part, spent the week following the incident in apparently good spirits. He had expanded his vocabulary with at least 3 new phrases, the origins of which Margaret attributed to his time in the study. He used them selectively, in contexts that suggested he understood their weight. He was eating well. He was sleeping well. He seemed, if anything, pleased. Whatever he had gone to that study for, warmth, curiosity, the particular quality of morning light through those east-facing windows, or something else entirely that no one would ever be able to fully account for, he seemed to have found it. And, in the long, quiet corridors of the palace, among the people who knew the full story and carried it with the specific fondness reserved for things that are real and strange and irreducibly themselves, that was more than enough. The grey London sky had cleared by the time David drove home that first evening. A strip of pale yellow light sat on the western horizon, the kind that arrives too late in the day to warm anything but is beautiful in its own quiet way. He noticed it. He was the kind of person who noticed things. It was, after all, more or less the job. He thought about the report he was going to have to file. The language he would need to find. The box on the form labeled nature of threat that was going to require something he had never typed into it before. He thought about Winston's expression when the door had opened. That flat, direct, completely unimpressed look. The head tilt. The pause before speaking, like he was deciding whether the situation merited a response at all. And, then, the response. Absolutely not. David laughed in his car, alone, on a Tuesday evening in November, with the London streets going grey around him. 11 years. He had never written an incident report that ended with a parrot. He was going to enjoy writing this one. The incident report that David Hartley filed on the evening of Winston's third escape was, by his own admission, the strangest document he had produced in his career. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside him, and he stared at the blank form for a long moment before he typed the first word. The form had fields designed for a certain kind of event. Intruder description.
Threat level assessment. Response actions taken. Outcome.
These were fields built for situations involving human beings with human intentions, and David filled them in with the careful, neutral language of a professional who understands that official documents are read by people who were not there and who will form their entire understanding of an event from what is written down.
He described the unauthorized presence of a non-human occupant in a secured room.
He noted the vocal disturbance that had triggered the response. He detailed the timeline, the radio exchange with control, the entry, the assessment, the outcome. He used precise language throughout. He noted that the principal was unharmed and undisturbed, that the situation was resolved without incident, and that the enclosure of the animal in question had been reviewed and modified as a preventive measure.
He did not write the word parrot until the 4th paragraph.
When he read the report back before submitting it, he thought it was probably the most carefully constructed piece of understatement he had ever produced.
It said everything that needed to be said.
It said nothing that didn't. And, somewhere in the space between the formal language and the facts it was describing, if you read it at the right angle, you could almost hear Winston saying absolutely not to an empty room. He submitted it at 9:30.
He went to bed.
He slept surprisingly well. The report made its way through the standard review process, and, at some point in the days that followed, it was seen by enough people in the security administration that the story attached to it, the real story, the one with the bird and the oak door and the king trying not to laugh, became known beyond David's immediate team. No one spoke about it publicly. That was understood without being said. But, internally, among the people responsible for the king's security, it became a reference point. When new officers were being briefed on the particularities of the palace environment, it started appearing in the unofficial portion of those conversations, the part where someone who had been around a while would lean back and say something like, "And I'll tell you one that's not in the manual." Margaret O'Say, meanwhile, had spent the week after the study incident conducting what she privately referred to as a full audit of Winston's situation. This was not her first time assessing his containment after an escape, but it was the first time she had done it with the specific awareness that he had managed to navigate through a secured area of the palace, past 2 checkpoints, and into a room that was supposed to have been occupied only by the king.
That level of route finding required thought. It required memory.
It required, in her assessment, a plan. She had been working with African gray parrots long enough to say that last word without flinching. Winston had been a working bird for most of his life before coming to the palace. African greys used for research and behavioral study develop differently from parrots kept purely as companion animals. They are problem solvers by training as well as instinct, and the good ones develop what researchers in the field describe as object permanence, causal reasoning, and a capacity for deferred goal behavior that puts them well ahead of most animals people expect to find making decisions.
The good ones remember layouts. They track routines.
They understand that if a particular thing happens at a particular time, a particular outcome follows. Winston was, by any measure, one of the good ones. Margaret had watched him for years. She had watched him watch other people. She had watched him learn the names of staff members after hearing them used only 2 or 3 times. She had watched him develop preferences, not random associations, but real preferences, with apparent reasons behind them.
He liked mornings.
He liked rooms with high ceilings. He liked the east-facing windows of the palace for exactly the reason a person might. The morning light came in clean and warm, and he would sit in it with the concentrated pleasure of someone who had earned a rest. The king's private study had east-facing windows. She thought about that for a while. The 2 modifications to Winston's enclosure were completed by Friday. Margaret inspected both and said what she had said before: they were improvements. She stopped short of calling them solutions, because she had stopped calling things solutions where Winston was involved after the first escape, when she had been fairly confident the enclosure was secure and had been proven wrong within 8 days. She had learned to operate in the vocabulary of containment rather than certainty.
You made things harder.
You reduced the probability. You remained, at all times, aware that the bird was thinking. The junior members of the care staff found this philosophy somewhere between admirable and unnerving, depending on the day. What none of them had expected, and What made the weeks following the study incident genuinely complicated in a way the original event hadn't been was that Winston seemed to know something had changed.
Birds do not grieve in the human sense. Margaret was careful about that.
But they have routines, and, when routines change, they respond.
Winston had been accustomed to a certain amount of movement through the palace.
Supervised, controlled movement time outside the enclosure with his handler present, occasional access to additional spaces during periods when the household permitted it. After the study incident, that movement had been temporarily restricted while the enclosure was assessed and the modified protocols were put in place.
It was a reasonable precaution. It was the right call. Winston disagreed.
He made this clear through a combination of behaviors that Margaret logged with the patient specificity of a scientist documenting a phenomenon she finds interesting rather than troubling. He was louder than usual. He was more insistent. He deployed vocabulary in ways that were targeted rather than random. He had a particular phrase he used when he wanted to communicate frustration, a short, clip sound that didn't belong to any human language and that he had apparently invented for this purpose, and he used it with a frequency and precision that left no room for misinterpretation. He also, on 3 separate occasions during the first week of restricted movement, sat facing the door of his enclosure without moving for extended periods.
Just watching it. Patient as stone.
Margaret noted this in her log and did not find it comforting. On the 10th day following the study incident, she made a recommendation to the household team that Winston's supervised movement be reinstated, with the new protocols in place.
The recommendation was approved.
The first outing under the new protocols took place on a Thursday morning, with Margaret present and a secondary handler also in attendance. Winston emerged from the enclosure with the composure of someone who had been waiting for this to happen and had known it would. He was, for the entirety of the outing, impeccably behaved. Margaret wrote in her log afterward, subject compliant throughout.
No incidents. Appeared to understand parameters of current arrangement.
She underlined the word appeared. She did not entirely know what to do with what she was observing, and she was experienced enough to find that interesting rather than alarming. The easy reading was that Winston was a very intelligent bird with strong preferences who had found a way to pursue those preferences and had been temporarily inconvenienced. The harder reading, the one she turned over on her walk home that evening, was that he had also adjusted. That when the conditions changed, he had registered the change, waited, and updated his behavior accordingly. Not abandoned his preferences. The watching of the door had been real, the frustration had been real, but modified his expression of them to fit the new reality.
That was not how most animals behaved. That was not even how most people behaved.
She thought about him sitting in the king's study on that Tuesday morning. The pen nudged across the desk. The head tilt at the photograph. The way he had looked at David Hartley in the doorway, not startled, not guilty, just assessing. Taking in the new variable and deciding what to do with it. She thought about absolutely not delivered to an empty room before David had ever opened the door.
What had he been responding to? Was it something on the desk he had examined and objected to? Was it a sound from outside the window? Was it some internal calculation that had reached a conclusion he found unsatisfactory? She would never know. That was the thing about Winston.
You could observe him for years, build a detailed picture of his behavior, track patterns across hundreds of interactions, and still arrive at moments where the explanation slipped sideways out of reach. Where whatever was happening inside him remained his, fully and entirely, and you were left watching from the outside making your best guesses. It was, in its way, the thing she loved most about the work. David Hartley, for his part, had moved through the weeks following the incident with the straightforward continuity of a man who has processed something unusual and filed it appropriately. He thought about it sometimes in the particular idle moments of his job, standing outside a door, watching a corridor, not with lingering anxiety but with a kind of fond amusement. It had become one of his stories, the kind you keep because they are genuinely yours, because they happen to you and no one else, and because they contain something real about the strangeness that lives inside even the most orderly institutions. He had never told it outside the palace. He had no particular inclination to. The story worked best, he felt, when it was still small, something that lived in the imagination of the people who actually knew these rooms and these routines, who could picture the specific corridor and the specific door and the specific quality of silence that preceded the raised voice. People who knew what it felt like to push open a door not knowing what was on the other side. That group of people could hold the story in a way that a general audience probably couldn't, because they understood what the stakes of that moment felt like, even when the resolution was a parrot on a desk. There was one morning, about 3 weeks after the incident, when David was posted outside a different room on a different part of his rotation and the radio crackled with a message from another officer, routine, procedural, nothing unusual, but the voice on the other end had a tone of slight bafflement that made David's internal antenna go up before the words fully registered. He asked for clarification. The other officer described a sound he couldn't account for coming from a room that should have been empty. What kind of sound? David asked. A pause. Like someone talking. Clearly. But no one's in there. David waited. I'm going in, the officer said. David waited. The radio crackled. Then, oh. And then, from a distance, filtered through static and the length of a palace corridor, a voice that was not quite human and not quite anything else said something in a clipped, definitive tone that David couldn't make out clearly but that he had absolutely no doubt about the general shape of. He pressed the transmit button. African gray, he said. About 12 inches tall. Goes by Winston. Don't let him near the correspondence. A longer pause this time. Copy that, the other officer said. David released the button. He faced the corridor. He stood with his back straight and his eyes moving. Left, right, down the long hall, back again. He was smiling. The palace in autumn had a particular quality in the mid-morning hours. The light came in low and gold through the tall windows, lying across the floors in long rectangular shapes that moved imperceptibly as the morning progressed. The heating ticked and settled. The gardens outside were stripped back and quiet. Inside, the building breathed in its particular way, the accumulated rhythm of centuries of routine pressing down over the newer and stranger things that happened inside it day by day. Winston had been part of this building for several years now, and, in the way that things become part of a place when they stay long enough, he was woven into it. Not officially. Not in any register or protocol document. But, in the stories that circulated among the people who worked there, in the 2 modified brackets on his enclosure that would remain long after everyone who remembered why they were there had moved on, in the particular way Margaret walked into certain rooms slightly ahead of schedule now, checking things that didn't strictly need checking. He was in the building. The building had adjusted to contain him. He was adjusting to the new parameters. Both parties, in their way, were managing. There were mornings, Margaret noticed this, had noted it in her log without knowing exactly what notation to apply, when Winston would sit at the highest point of his enclosure and face east. Not pacing, not vocalizing, just sitting. Still. The morning light would reach him through the narrow window of the room, not the full generous pour he had found in the king's study, but something. A version of it. A portion. He would sit in it for a while. Then, he would turn, make his clipped sound that meant whatever it meant to him, and get on with his day. Out in the corridor, David Hartley was doing the same thing. 27 steps to the study. The floorboard on the east corridor that still creaked in exactly the same place it always had. The particular weight of a Tuesday morning in November settling over the building like something familiar. Routine. Precise. The kind of silence that holds its shape until something extraordinary decides to break it. He walked his post. He kept his eyes moving. He was ready for whatever came through the next door, and he knew now, in a way he hadn't quite known before that particular Tuesday, that ready had nothing to do with expecting the reasonable thing. Ready meant the door opens and you see what's there, and you respond to what is actually in the room, not what you thought would be. It was a small lesson. It was a good one. He had a gray parrot to thank for it.